All right, let's do this. We're going to jump in our time machine and set the dial for one single frozen moment in time. Britain, February 1956. And what we're going to find is a country that's right on the brink, just teetering on the edge of a massive, massive transformation. And I mean, seriously, the very first thing you'd notice is the cold. An unbelievable, biting cold. This wasn't your average winter chill. Nope. February 1956 went down as one of the coldest months on record. They even gave it a name, the Big Freeze. And believe me, it had the entire nation in its grip. And this gives you a sense of what it was like. We're talking about the sea literally freezing over in Poole Harbor, down on the south coast. Can you imagine? And the River Thames in London. It wasn't really flowing. It was just choked solid with these huge chunks of ice. So you've got this entire nation shivering, huddled around coal fires in these drafty post-war houses. It was a chill you could feel in your bones, but it was also kind of metaphorical. So, okay, the country is physically frozen solid, but behind the scenes, in the world of politics, things were definitely starting to heat up. You had Anthony Eden as the prime minister, and that sort of stable post-war consensus, that general agreement on how the country should be run. Well, the first little cracks were starting to appear. And you've got to remember what was fresh in everyone's minds. Just a few years before, back in 1952, London was completely smothered by the Great Smog. I mean, a deadly, poisonous fog, all from burning coal. It was a huge national trauma, and so the very air people were breathing, that had become a major political hot potato. Which brings us right back to our frozen February. In this exact month, Parliament was in the middle of this intense debate over something called the Clean Air Act. This was a huge deal, a landmark piece of legislation. So you have this amazing contrast. Outside, everyone's shivering from the cold, but inside, there's this fiery debate raging about how to clean up the nation's air for good. It was a direct response, a promise of never again after that great smog. All right, so that's politics. Now let's switch gears and talk about what people were doing to escape the cold. Let's go to the movies. Because if you walked into a cinema in February 1956, you'd be walking right into the middle of this fascinating cultural battle, a showdown between the old Britain and something completely new and rebellious. And this right here, this just says it all. In one corner, you've got The Reach for the Sky. It's the story of a stoic British war hero. The absolute epitome of that stiff upper lip, keep calm and carry on spirit. But then, crashing in from America, you've got Rebel Without a Cause. And James Dean, he was the absolute polar opposite. He wasn't about duty, he was about this restless, misunderstood, new kind of youth. And look, this is a really big deal. You have to understand, before this, the whole idea of a teenager didn't really exist like it does today. You were a kid, and then, bam, you were basically a small adult. But James Dean, with the blue jeans and that iconic jacket, he gave this brand new group an identity, a uniform. And suddenly, businesses realized there was this huge, untapped market. This wasn't just about clothes. It was the birth of a whole new economic force, with its own music, its own movies, and its own money to spend. A real cultural earthquake was starting to rumble. And that exact same tension, the old guard versus the new wave, it was happening in music too. What you were supposed to be listening to on the radio was a million miles away from the sounds that were bubbling up from the underground. So if you switched on the BBC's official hit parade, this is the kind of stuff you'd get. K-Star singing the Rock and Roll Waltz, or Dean Martin with Memories Are Made of This. It's all very polite, very melodic, and let's be honest, completely safe. This was your parents' music, through and through. But if you knew where to go, if you slipped away from the mainstream and down into one of those steamy, packed coffee bars in London's Soho, you would have heard something else entirely. Something raw, something energetic, and something that was about to absolutely explode. And that sound was called skiffle. The undisputed king, a guy named Lonnie Donegan. His track Rock Island Line was actually storming up the charts in this very month. And just look at the instruments they were using. A washboard for percussion, a bass made from a tea chest and a broom handle. This was the absolute definition of DIY music. Kids were just grabbing whatever they could find. It was cheap, it was loud, and this is the key, it was theirs. It was the sound of British youth finally making a noise all their own. Okay, so we've talked about these big, grand ideas. Movies, music, culture. But sometimes the biggest revolutions are the quietest ones. And one was happening in, of all places, the local grocery shop. And this was a change that really affected everyone's daily life. Think about this for a second. Food rationing, something that had defined British life for more than a decade, had only just ended completely in 1954. So just 2 years later, this newfangled idea of a self-service shop, basically the granddaddy of the modern supermarket, was mind-blowing. The simple act of walking down an aisle and just choosing whatever you wanted off a shelf, that was a radical, brand new experience. The whole era of consumer choice was just beginning to flicker into life. So let's pull all these threads together, right? You've got the frozen weather, the heated politics, the clash at the cinema, the new sounds in the coffee bars, and even a revolution in the grocery aisles. When you put it all together, the picture of February 1956 becomes crystal clear. It's a country poised right on the edge. The big thaw, in every sense of the word, was about to begin. It really was a tale of two Britons, coexisting in that one moment. The Britain of yesterday, with its bowler hats and steam trains, was still there. But the Britain of tomorrow, of blue jeans and electric guitars, was right around the corner. You had the formal world of sir and ma'am, but you also had the new, loud voice of the teenager. You had the polite hit parade on the radio, but you had rebellious DIY skiffle taking over the coffee bars. The old ration book way of thinking was being replaced by this new world of self-service and choice. Two completely different worlds, sharing the same space at the same time. So, we leave this single frozen month with one last thought. Britain in February 1956 was a country just holding its breath. It was caught, suspended between a very gray, rigid past and a future that was about to explode in full-blown technicolor, full of noise and rebellion. You could almost hear the ice cracking. And the real question, whether anyone realized it at the time or not, was a simple one. What happens when a world that's been frozen solid finally begins to thaw?